Alrighty. I'm just gonna go about assuming that folks will start jumping in pretty soon. But we want to make sure that we make the most of our time here today, so I'll go ahead and get started. While folks are kind of jumping in, let me know in the chat if you get a chance what you want to know about APIs. What is it about APIs that brought you to this session? What are you curious about? I'd love to know that. While you're doing that, I would like to share that I am super excited to be hosting this workshop with you all today. My hope is that folks are able to take some really cool learnings out of this very introductory session and apply it to your next project. We will be looking at some absolute basics when it comes to APIs, and we'll get to tinker around in Postman as well. No prior knowledge about APIs is going to be needed for today's session. While you're here, if things are still feeling a little bit flaky, no worries. You can always take our Postman Student Expert training at your own pace for free anytime. But if you do have questions for me today, throw those into the chat as they start coming to mind, because I'm planning on jumping into those questions right after the session. So please don't shy away from asking. I am here as a resource for folks. If I don't get a chance to address your questions today, you can find me on socials. You'll see those handles in the next slide. And you can also connect with anyone at Postman through our Discord community. Those links and the QR code for that will be at the end of the presentation. I do want to give folks a quick heads up that I'll have questions for you throughout the workshop today as well. I shared this with Neha earlier. We'll see how those Q&As go throughout the session. But you can share responses to those in the chat as we go along as well. There's going to be a social media challenge for those folks who are paying really close attention today. Winners of that challenge will get to choose their own swag from our Postman Swag store. So if you want to grab a notebook and a pen, maybe take some screenshots, go for it. I'll share details about that later in today's presentation too. And then last thing, like I said earlier, we'll get a chance to use Postman to follow along, but to do that, you're going to need to sign up for a free Postman account. You don't need to download the desktop app, but you're free to do that if you want. The browser agent of Postman is going to work just fine for our purposes today, but if you choose not to follow along, that's all right. The session is being recorded, so you can choose to follow along later and maybe just watch for now. But with that, I will jump right in. So I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Ruby, my pronouns are she and her, and I'm a senior developer advocate at Postman, which is a platform that millions of folks are using to work with APIs. I haven't always been in the tech space, though. I was previously an elementary and early ed school teacher. A series of very fortunate events, supportive people, the choice to graduate from a coding boot camp, and a whole lot of hard work led me to where I am today, which for the most part has involved continuing to find ways to spread knowledge. Here's a quick snapshot of what we'll be covering today. By the end of the session, you should be able to explain why API education is important, explain what an API is to your own post person, explain what goes on with APIs behind the scenes, so how servers and clients relate to one another, how to make an API request yourself and analyze its responses, and then we'll have a follow-along portion where you can test out an API in Postman. Like I said earlier, I'm going to do my best to carve out some space for a Q&A at the end of today's session too. Awesome. So starting out with a quick background on API education and Postman student programs. So to illustrate why API education is a big deal, I've added a GIF here from a powerful and meme-worthy moment in history when Steve Ballmer from Microsoft was playing up the importance of developers. I added it because, for the most part, developers are the ones who care a lot about APIs, but they're certainly not the only ones who should. I've also linked some study findings in here, in which survey respondents were all actually API users. What the study reveals is that lots of different roles actually benefit from the standardized data access provided by APIs. So you got folks in management caring about APIs, solutions architects, business and data analysts, educators, researchers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone's using APIs. Most professionals are going to need to access real data at some point in their careers. Whether they know it or not, they'll be tapping into APIs to accomplish that. And Postman makes it easy to speed up those API interactions. Because of Postman's super helpful features around APIs, the tools become kind of an industry standard used by many top companies, as you can see here. And there's a poster behind me where we have some of our top customers as well. Folks like Twilio, Salesforce, really recognizable names back there. If you're learning about Postman, you're already ahead of the curve because employers at most companies are looking for people who can easily use and understand developer tools like Postman. There's over 20 million folks already using Postman, so chances are pretty high that you're going to need to interact with it at some point on your journey as you work alongside tech professionals. Great, so we'll be diving into the nitty-gritty of what APIs are and how you can use one to supercharge your applications. But as a heads up, a lot of what we'll be discussing is covered in detail in Postman Student Expert training. That training is self-paced, hands-on, and free. And it's something that you can always revisit as much as you need. Plus, you get a really cool certificate and a badge when you complete the training. So you can throw that onto your social profiles, your resume, wherever you want. I can't emphasize enough that this training is going to set you up for success when using APIs. All right, so the million-dollar question, which I'm sure brought some folks here. What exactly is an API? So here is a very quick pulse check. Having had little or no background from me yet on what exactly an API is, which of these services do you think involves APIs? Is it A, an application's login or sign-up flow where you can use authentication from another source? Is it B, adding songs to a playlist in an application like Spotify? C, closing out your online shopping cart on a website? Or D, receiving a text message confirmation from a website? You can throw your response into the chat. Let me know which one you think involves APIs. I see Amukta's response to the earlier question. Nice. D question mark? We'll see. All right, so this was actually kind of an unfair trick question. The truth is that APIs really are everywhere. They're responsible for allowing code in one corner of the internet to talk to code in another corner. So what's an API? API stands for Application Programming Interface. APIs are considered to be the building blocks of modern software. So like we said before, APIs allow code to talk to code. You can picture an API as a contract or an agreement between code sources. APIs are what let Cindy Lou's homemade weather app use information stored on some server containing weather data. That real data is exposed through an API, a contract, that Cindy follows in her application in order to collect the information she needs. Sometimes, like Cindy, we need to get data from a service like Google, Facebook, Twitter. These are just some examples. Since we don't have access to those companies' code bases, they create APIs so that developers can get information from their services without accessing the code base. Both developers and non-developers use APIs to get data from popular services that they can use in their own projects. Awesome, so let's see an API in action. I'm going to show you a Postman collection containing different related requests. One request will be using a messaging API to send myself a reminder about something. I won't dive into the inner workings of the API I'm using just yet, but I'd like to show you quickly how easy it is to use Postman to get access to this kind of data through APIs. So I'm going to tab on over to Postman here. I'm already signed in. Just a heads up, this is not the follow along portion. You can just watch this for now. I'm signed in and I'm actually in a public workspace called Girls ReCode Demo Workspace. This is public, which means that if you're in Postman, you can search for this and you'll have access to all of the same collections to play around with. So here I am in the Girls ReCode Demo Workspace. In here, I have a collection called Twilio Messaging. And this is going to be using the Twilio API. As a background, in order to use the Twilio API, I needed to go to developer.twilio.com or Twilio's developer portal. I had to sign up, let them know I'm going to build a project, tell them what the project's about so that they can establish trust with me as a developer. And once we did that, they sent over credentials for me. That means they sent over a key, an authentication token, and everything else I need to get started with their API. So if you're using a public API like Twilio's, you're going to need to set up that profile with them first so that you can get the credentials to work with their API. So I've already set that up, and I've saved all of those Twilio credentials in a Postman environment called Twilio Creds. And so you can see that some of these things are no longer red. And you can see in the scope in my environment, I've already set this variable to the value that Twilio gave me. Cool. So in this collection, I have a folder called Getting Started, and then a request called Send an SMS. To send this request, I needed a Twilio SID, which that has resolved now that I have that credential. This is authorized in the same way as the whole collection. My password also is an authentication token that I got from Twilio. And to send this request, I actually need a body. In that body, I need a message to send to myself, the actual SMS. I needed a phone number, my own phone number, a fake phone number, just FYI, that I got from Google Voice. And then a phone number that Twilio assigned me once I set up a profile with them. So I've already set this up. I have my fake Google Voice phone number, which is over here. You can see I have a ton of testing messages that I sent to myself. The last one says, "This is a test, exclamation, exclamation." So now I'm going to send a new one. Don't forget the swag challenge for this workshop. You'll want to take great notes. So I'm going to go ahead and send this. And down here in response world, you can see I got a success code, and you can see the response body. The API is letting me know, hey, this is what got sent over. And here's some extra notes about what we sent. Awesome. So let's see if it was actually successful. I'm going to go back to Google Voice. And now I have a new message down here. Don't forget the swag challenge for this workshop. You'll want to take great notes. Awesome. That was actually really fast. On the surface, you just saw me sending a message to myself, but there was quite a bit of action going on under the hood there. To have been able to get that message, I needed to access Twilio's API, and I was able to access it by following its contract, which is all documented in their docs or API documentation online. But what's the real 1-2 step here on a very high level? Let's imagine APIs as data liaisons through a very popular analogy. You can think of an API as a waiter at a restaurant. So imagine you go to your favorite restaurant. For me right now, it's Reali's, which is an Italian restaurant down the road. And you can order some food at this restaurant. I'll be ordering pasta probably at Reali's. You're the client at the restaurant. You're going to be sending your request through the waiter who tells the kitchen what to make. The staff in the kitchen process your order or your request, gather ingredients, and prepare everything according to specifications. The waiter's going to come back with your food, or they might come back to tell you that the kitchen actually doesn't have what you ordered. Regardless, the waiter serves as that liaison between you and the kitchen so that you in the front of the restaurant never have to know what's going on in the back. And that's what APIs do for clients and services. You're the client in this case, probably using a browser to go to some website. Let's say you're participating in the swag challenge that I'll talk more about at the end of the presentation. To participate, you're going to need to create a tweet. To do that on Twitter's servers, you're going to be making an HTTP post request through Twitter's API. If you want to check out all the tweets with the Postman student hashtag or the girls ReCode hashtag, you'll have to make a GET request through Twitter's API with some parameters for those hashtags. So you can start to see how you can't really interact with websites or apps without the help of an API. The API is what handles your requests when you interact with a website or an application. The API is not something physical or visible. It exists as just a simplified concept like the waiter, written in code somewhere that the user cannot see. It'll reach out to where the data that you want lives on a server. Here is some terminology that you'll come across in conversations and in documentation about APIs, so it's helpful to know what these words mean. The client in our restaurant analogy was you, walking in and making your order. The client is the agent that makes a request. A client could be a browser, an application that you've coded. It could even be your command line on your computer if you're using curl commands. It's the thing that makes a request to a server. If I'm using Postman to make requests, Postman would be the client because it's allowing me to make requests and view responses from servers. A server controls resources and services. An API is that interface that's exposing these resources and services to clients over a network like the public internet. Requests and responses are like a call and response over a network to some server. So this is all great information about requests and responses and how they happen over a network between a client and a server with the help of an API, but what goes into requests and responses? Before I jump into that, I mentioned some apps and services that have APIs we've all probably used. And hopefully we're understanding that APIs are all over the digital world. Can you think of some APIs that you've come across in your day-to-day? You can let us know in the chat if you have interacted with an API that you know of. I've definitely used my Google login to sign into a bunch of random applications. Those applications used Google's API to allow that kind of authentication to happen. Maybe you've used Stripe's payment processing API to buy the latest Jordans online. So there's a ton of possibilities here. While folks are thinking on that one, let's dig a little bit deeper into requests and responses. So I'll just see what's going on over here. First, let's check out the anatomy of a request. During this segment of the presentation, we're going to be diving into the nitty-gritty of requests and responses and what goes into each of those. So here are some of those things that you'll find in a request. And we'll get a chance to look at what goes into a response pretty soon. But first, let's check out requests, the thing that a client first shares with an API. Methods, when you see them, they look a lot like verbs. They describe what an API is going to do with your request. The endpoint or path defines where the API should do those actions. Those two parts of the anatomy are the bare minimum needed to send a request. The others might be necessary based on your use case and how detailed you need to be when sending your request. And we'll take a closer look at those in a second as well. So zooming into methods and endpoints in requests, when we make a request to an API, we have to specify what we want to get out of the interaction. And we use HTTP methods to do that. Methods let the client know which action to use for that URL. And remember, a client can be anything you're using to make requests, like curl on your command line, an app that you've developed, your browser, or Postman. There's lots of methods out there, but the ones that are most commonly used are get, post, put, and delete. These correlate or map to operations like CRUD, which stands for create, read, update, or edit, and delete. You might have heard of these already if you've been studying APIs. If you think about a social media app where a user can select and view a profile, that user is making a GET request to retrieve that information, to get that profile or read it. An API goes ahead and delivers your request to the server where that data lives and returns the response, which is hopefully that profile, exactly what you've requested. When you try to add new tweets on your tweet timeline, for example, you're attempting a post request. I think it's even called posting. You're creating some new data on Twitter's data servers. If you were trying to delete tweets from the servers, you'd be attempting a delete request. Of course, some publicly accessible APIs are going to require you to be authorized or authenticated to make certain kinds of requests. You saw earlier how Twilio needed me to authorize a bunch of stuff and get some credentials to be able to send messages. Let's take a close look at put versus patch for just a second, because even in this table, they share the same definition, but they're a little bit different. Patch is for updating partial data of a record while keeping the other data. Put requests are designed to completely overwrite existing data on a record. And then in addition to a method, an API requires an endpoint. An endpoint includes a root URL with a path. So another part of requests outside of methods and endpoints is parameters. When you make an API call with a get method, it's usually going to retrieve everything from the URL address, and that can be pretty overwhelming. Parameters specify or zoom into the response data so you can get only the specific information you're looking for. And parameters are not always going to be needed in every request. You can always confirm what's needed for a request to an API by reading that API's documentation. You can see that there are query and path parameters, and they each have unique qualities about them that are visible in the URL. Query parameters always start with a question mark, and a series of query parameters is separated by an ampersand symbol. Path parameters come directly after a /, and they usually hold information like IDs. Let me show you how Google uses query parameters, and then I'll show you how Spotify uses path parameters. So here, I'm going to open a new tab, and I'm going to go to google.com. I want you to keep your eyes glued to what happens to this URL. So right now, I'm just at the root URL, google.com. But let's say I want to retrieve information about cats. So I'm going to type in cats here and check out what happens to my URL up top. Now it's a massive URL. I have my root URL here. I have a path called /search. And then I have a question mark and a bunch of what to the naked eye looks like gibberish. But the first thing here is this letter Q, an equal sign, and cats. Cats I recognize because that I threw into the search bar. This is actually a query, and that Q stands for query in Google's API. Here's an ampersand symbol letting you know that there's another query parameter coming up called source. And then there's another one called EI. Here's another one with a bunch of other letters. These look like these were auto-generated by Google. Let me actually copy this entire URL. And I'll paste that. Let me close this out. I'll paste that into this dummy collection I set up here that has an empty request, an empty GET request. And I'm going to paste that entire URL here. You can see that as soon as I did that, Postman was smart enough to separate all of the query parameters for me visually. So I can see that the query that I actually sent was cats. If I wanted to, I can toggle other things off or back on, depending on my use case. Let's say I'm testing an API and I don't need all these query parameters. I can toggle some on and off as I need them. If I send this, my response will be actually very similar to what you got in your browser. This is actually the body that I got back in HTML format. If I wanted to preview it, it'll kind of actually look like what I got back in my browser. The UI looks very similar. So that's a neat feature of Postman, is that you can preview HTML this way as well. If I had written some code in my test scripts to visualize the data differently, I could do that as well here. So there's lots of fun stuff going on down here. But this was the gist of query parameters. Let's see how, I'm going to not save this. Let's see how Spotify actually uses path parameters. So I'm going to get a list of tracks for a playlist. Up here, you can see I have my playlist ID. In Postman, this is called a path variable, but what that actually represents is this value, an ID. So my path parameter up here is actually an ID of a playlist from Spotify. Similar to Twilio, I actually have a profile set up with a developer profile set up with Spotify where I got credentials from. So I'm able to send this request. And down here in my JSON response, you can see all of the tracks that I have for a given playlist ID. It's a humongous response. I can see the actual size of that response here as well, which is pretty nifty. Cool. So that's query and path parameters on a super high level. Requests also have headers. A request can include headers that provide additional metadata about the request to the server. Metadata is data about data. Basically, headers can be thought of as the information that you would see on the outside of an envelope. There's still a message that's being sent within the envelope, but the outside of the envelope is going to tell you information about what's inside. So for example, like a return address or a fragile label. Headers are important for authorization. They allow clients to access protected resources from an API. In fact, it's actually common practice to send some authorization data like access tokens in the header. So you saw a while ago while I was using Twilio, I had an access token that was added to the header of my request. Twitter's API is going to require authorization as well, because if it didn't, anyone using the Twitter API could be able to post on my behalf or maybe even search private user information, which would not be ideal. If you can't remember what each of these headers are, don't worry. You can hover over tooltips in Postman to learn more about them at any time. So here in this request we were actually just looking at, if I tab over to headers up in request world here, you can see I have some hidden headers. If I maximize that, there's a bunch of them: authorization, host, and a whole bunch of stuff that I might not understand if I'm a junior developer. So I can hover over the tooltip here in Postman, and it's going to explain to me the significance of that header. Your response also, just jumping ahead a little bit, has its own headers. Like we said, headers are data about data. So check out how your response has data about the date that you got the response. This isn't the actual response body, but it's letting you know when you got the response. That's data about your data. So that's generally what headers are. Cool. So when you're interacting with a website or an application, you're not just going to be retrieving information. You won't always be making GET requests. There's going to be times when you need to add or change data that you find in an application. We talked earlier about other HTTP methods like post, put, and patch. For these methods to be used, your API is going to expect you to send something new with your request. And that's going to be sent through a request body. A body could also be sent to the client by the server in a response. So we've been checking out a lot of response bodies, but your request also has the option to send a body. You'll often see the body in JSON format. That's JSON, and that stands for JavaScript Object Notation. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily JavaScript. It's just an easy way to organize data in a readable format. Just like text is a data format, HTML is a data format, GraphQL is a data format that you can select and have your request body in as well. So we just went over the anatomy of a request. What is the bare minimum needed to send a request? That was like a very short detail I shared earlier. What is the bare minimum needed to send a request? We talked about parameters, we talked about methods and endpoints, we talked about a request body, lots of good stuff. What's the bare minimum? Give a couple seconds before I reveal it. So it's actually methods and endpoints or a path. So that is the bare minimum you need to send a request. That's often usually in a GET request. So when you send an API call or request, you are going to receive a response. So now we're moving into the anatomy of a response. There's a ton of really great information that you'll get back in the response body, like status codes, response headers, and a response body. We see things like latency, which if you're in QA, quality assurance, or otherwise just testing out an API, this could be helpful information to track performance. So let's see response world here. So down here, we saw our response come back in JSON format. We see other things here like headers. We see a status code. We see how long the response took to get to us. So this is the latency information, right? Let's say you're trying to design an API yourself. from scratch and you want it to be super efficient, you don't want it to take long, you don't want it to lag, this is something you'll pay attention to. This is going to help you create something with better performance, that latency information. APIs return status codes with every single response. 200 OK means successful. Other common examples are 201 created, 400 bad request, 401 unauthorized, 403 forbidden, 404 not found. You've probably seen a 404 error before at some point. If I mistype the URL for a website like rudy.com instead of ruby.com, I might get a 404 status code and an error message if no website like that exists. But if you take just one thing away from this slide, know that all 200s are success codes. All 300s are redirects. That means you're trying to do something somewhere that actually should be done somewhere else, and the API is going to give you that error message. 400s are client-side errors. That means that you might have made a whoops. That means maybe you sent the wrong authorization information. You'll get a 401 unauthorized in that case. 500s are server-side errors. So that is, for lack of a better way to put it, when things are on fire. So like in the case of like a DOS attack, a denial of service attack, you'll often see a 500 level error. And that usually happens because of the developer of that API or that data information not setting up good rate controls on that API that's set up for that server. You don't have to memorize all of these status codes either. Postman explains these codes to you like you saw earlier. If you hover over the status code in your response, you'll get information about it. And if that's not enough, you can always use status cats. I've added a link down here to a bunch of cat memes that actually explain what these status codes are. So if you're curious, you can catch that later. Awesome. So I've done a lot of talking so far. We can now finally get our hands dirty and test out an API for ourselves. We saw some APIs in action earlier, but let's actually try all of the CRUD actions that are available to us in another API. So hint, this is the follow along portion. So if you want to dive in with me, you are welcome to. I'm going to show you how I go through the home page in Postman, and you can follow along with me to find the Postman Library API v2. So let me actually pull that up. So I'm going to actually exit out of everything here, minimize this, and I'm going to go to my home page. If you've just signed up for Postman, this is what your home page, your landing page is going to look like. Up top in your search bar, you're going to type in, actually before I tell you what to type in there, I do want to highlight something here on your landing page. You'll notice 4 tabs up here. When you're working in Postman, all of the magic happens in workspaces. That's where all the work happens, in workspaces. And everyone by default, when they sign up, they get one called My Workspace. And it's a personal workspace. No one has access to it, just you. So you'll be working out of My Workspace for this follow along portion. So I did want to point that out before we jump into the Postman Library API v2. So up in the search bar up top, I'm going to type in Postman Library API v2. And you'll see a couple of responses here. There's an icon here that represents a workspace, and it's called Postman Library API v2. Looks like it's being maintained by the Postman account, and it's a public workspace. This is probably where I should go. So I'm going to select that. And there's just one collection in here, but that's the collection I need to use. I'm going to select it. And I see some documentation over on the right for how to use it. Some background information on what the actual collection is, what API it's using. Great information about the authorization for this. There's an API key that I have to use. It's telling me this is public, so I have to be careful about the way that I use it. And then some background on why and how it's different from the previous version of the Postman Library API. Awesome. I want to start using this collection, but there is a padlock on this collection. If you hover over that padlock, it says read only. That means that you can only look at it while it's in this workspace. Emphasis on while it's in this workspace. So if I go over to this collection and I hit these triple dots, the More Actions menu, I'll see an option to create a fork of this collection. When you create a fork, you're basically creating a copy of something, but it's called fork because it maintains an association with the original. So if I create a fork here, Postman is going to open up this new view. I can call my fork whatever I want. Usually I like keeping the default name. And you can move your fork or your copy to whatever workspace you want. So in your case, you can move it to my workspace. I actually have a copy of this already. I've already forked this to my Girls ReCode demo workspace. So I'm going to move into that workspace. But in your case, if you're doing this for the first time, you can go ahead and select Fork Collection. So I'm going to skip over that because I've already done that. And I'm just going to go into Girls ReCode demo workspace. In your case, Postman would have already transported you into my workspace. So you should be seeing something similar. Here is my copy, my fork of that same collection with all of the same documentation. So let me actually take a closer look at that documentation. Here's some background on what you'll be able to do with this collection. So essentially, you're putting on the hat of a librarian. You're managing a library, a digital library, and folks are checking books out of your library. They might be adding new books to your library. Some of these books might start getting lost, so you have to delete these books. And that's essentially your job while you're using this collection. Looks like some books have this field in their record called is permanent collection. And if it's set to true, that means it's part of our library's permanent collection and they probably can't be deleted. This API also requires some authorization for certain requests. Notice that you don't need authorization for the GET request. You need it for the post, patch, and delete requests. And it looks like this documentation is telling you what your API key is. It's going to be Postman rules, spelled this way without an E and with a Z at the end. I'm just going to copy that. And it says I need to set that at the collection level in my collection variables. Here's a quick note. In the real world, you would generate an API key with the API's developer portal service, like Twilio, like Twitter, like Spotify. This is just a training API, so we provided the API key to you. API keys are very private things, and you should be very careful about ever sharing those. It's best practice to always hide or mask that information. So we're going to copy this API key, and we're going to go to this collection's collection variables. So you'll notice the collection is still highlighted. That means we're still looking at the collection, and we're going to tab over to variables. Right here, we see API key, and I'm going to paste in Postman rules. Spelled exactly the same way with the same casing. There's no capitals in here, it looks like. And then I'm going to save it with this More Actions menu. Cool. So now I should be able to use all of the requests. Let's see if the documentation has any other important information. Looks like all that's left was to check out what was different from the previous API. That's kind of just background information, so that's all right to ignore for now. And I close my documentation. All right, so now that I have this API key set at my collection, every request within that collection should have access to it. So I'm going to open up this books folder. And in my books folder, I have a get request to get all the books and a post request to add a book. Let me first get all the books that are in the library because I'm curious to see what's in there. So here's request world up here. If I just send this request, I see a JSON response. There's a bunch of records in here. Here's one record. Here's another record. And there's Grammarly. Here's another record. Lots of different books in here. Each record looks like an individual book. This book has its own ID, which is different from this book's ID and different from this book's ID. I see other fields in here like title, author, genre, year published, checked out, is permanent collection, created at timestamp, and looks like every record has all of those fields. Cool. Let's say I want to actually get only the books that are not checked out. I can select my query parameter checked out and make it false. So now I'm zooming into the response data to get only the books that are not checked out. If I send that now, I should only get books that are not checked out. Here's one that has checked out set to false. This one's also checked out to false. And it looks like all of them are not checked out down here. King of Wrath, not checked out. Cool. You can do the same with genre. Let's say you want to see fiction books that are not checked out. You can send that as well. And the idea is kind of the same. It starts zooming into the response data again, just to get those specific books that are fiction and are not checked out. Lots of flexibility there. You could even search for specific authors, whatever you want. So I'm going to actually uncheck these. I'm all set with this request because I saw that this library actually is missing one of my favorite books. So I'm going to go to post and add that book to the library. So in this post request, notice that this is no longer getting information. I'm going to create information on the server. So this is a post request and the API wants to know what I want to post. It's not going to know what I want to post unless I give it a request body. So I'm going to go over to the body of this request. And it looks like I have a stub over here that I can fill in. I can add the author, the title, the author, the genre, and the year published of this book. Let me actually see if I can get rid of Grammarly. Yes, please. Cool. All right, so here's a new book that I can add. This is a stub, though. I'm going to add my own book that I happen to be checking out now. So the title of that book is The Very Busy Spider. And the author of that book is actually Eric Carle. The genre of that book is not self-help. It's actually a fiction book. And it was published in 1984. So cool. This is my custom book that I want to add to the Postman library. So I'm going to go ahead and send this. And you'll notice that after I created my book, I got all of the stuff that you typically would expect in a response. I got a status code letting me know that this was a success. Remember, all 200s are successes, but this one is 201 created. So specifically for my post request, I got the thumbs up that this got created. And down here, you can see the record that was added. I only gave it a title, an author, a genre, and a year published, but it auto-generated some other fields. So if you're designing your own API, you can have some things auto-generated, and that would be up to you as a developer to design that in your API. Great. I also noticed that this book has a very unique ID that is different from any other book in the library. So I'm going to copy that actually. Copying the ID of the book I just created. And now let's say I notice that it's actually not checked out. I want to check this book out. So I'm going to go into the ID folder here, and I'm going to go to the patch request, update a book by ID. So to check out this book, I need to change one field in the record of that book. It had all these other fields, but I just need to change checked out. I don't need to change the entire record. I don't need to make a put request. I need to change just one partial piece of data for that record, so I'll be making a patch request. Now the API wants to know what is the ID of that book that I'm going to be updating. So I'm going to erase what's already there and add the ID of my book. And if you haven't already been, you should be saving all of these requests. You'll notice Postman reminds you with these orange dots up here to save those requests. And I'm going to tab over for this request into the body. And you'll notice a stub here already set up for you. We're going to change checked out to be true. Previously, it was false. So I'm going to send this request and see what happens. Awesome. I got a 200 level status code letting me know that worked. Here is the ID of my book, the book specifically that I was working with. Now checked out is set to true. Let's say I checked out this book and I was a very irresponsible steward of the library and I lost the book. Now nobody can use this book. No one can read it. No one will benefit from Eric Carle's wonderful wisdom. And I'll have to delete this book from the library. It's gone forever now. So I'm going to take that same ID. It should still be on your clipboard, but just in case, you can copy it. And we're going to go to this delete request. So in this delete request, kind of the same idea, put in the ID. Notice this is a path variable or a path parameter up here. And I'm going to add the ID of the book that I'm working with. There's no body that I need to add for this request because this is a delete request. The API knows I'm not giving it new information. I'm not changing anything. I'm just getting this ID and deleting it from the server. So if I send this now with the ID of the book I'm working with, I didn't get any response body, which is actually good for this delete request. Notice that I still got a 200 level status code, 204 no content. The server successfully processed the request, but it's not returning any content. That's good. That means that there's no content to return. That means I successfully deleted it. But let's say I'm going to try to delete it again. Now this book doesn't exist, and I'm still trying to delete it. Let's see what happens then. Here's a whoops, a client-side error, a 400 level error. You just tried to do something that can't happen on the server. 404 not found. You gave it an ID that doesn't exist. That book is already gone. So in this case right now, for our example, this is what we expected. But if you see a 404 like this, maybe double check that that resource does exist. So note for your future self. Awesome. So we just did CRUD, create, read, update, and delete with our own API here. We sometimes get folks saying, all right, cool, I can do a lot of API stuff in Postman, but how do I get all of that into my own project that I'm hosting on GitHub or GitLab? If you'd like to use what you've been able to do in Postman in your own applications code, you could generate code for your requests in a number of different languages to copy and paste right into VS Code or into your terminal as well. So let's see what that looks like. For our get books request over here, and really for any of them, if you hover all the way to the right where we saw documentation earlier, underneath it, there's this icon for code. If you select that, you can actually pick a language that you want that request to be in. So if you're working with JavaScript, you can select that, copy all of that code right into VS Code, right into your project that you're then pushing into GitHub. Let's say I wanted to do curl. I can copy this, and let's say I'm using curl commands. I'm going to throw it into my terminal and see what happens. Paste that in there. And I actually got the exact same response that I got in Postman, but this is obviously not great to read. These are all of the books in the library, but it's just a lot. It's a wall of text. It's not highlighted. It's not indented. It's not as much fun. So I'm going to go ahead and close that, but you do have that option if you want to do that. You can grab the code anytime. There's also integrations with your favorite Git repositories baked right into Postman, but we won't dive into that today. If you're curious about any of these cool features in Postman and how to use them, you can check out Postman's documentation because Postman is a tool and technology. It's got its own manual. It's got its own documentation in the Postman Learning Center. There's a link for that and other resources in a slide at the end here. Cool, so let's recap what we just did. We got a background on API education and why it's important and kind of what the Postman Student Programs does with API education. Then we talked about what exactly is an API. We took a look at APIs behind the scenes, so clients and servers and the request response pattern. We took a look at the anatomies of requests and responses, and we got to try some stuff out. Here are those resources that I mentioned earlier. These are general Postman resources, which are helpful for most people who are using Postman. In your slide deck, you should have a link to our YouTube playlist with lots of fun API-related videos as well. I believe I shared that slide deck with Neha, so you should be seeing it if you haven't already. And then, like I said, Postman is a technology that comes with its own manual, so of course it has its own documentation. The Learning Center, or Postman docs, are linked here for you, and you can find more information there about how to visualize your data that you get back in a response, how how to use mock servers, how to use the code generation feature that we took a look at, how to start from scratch designing your API in the API builder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is a whole API platform that you'll be using. The API network here, explore.postman.com, is where you can find lots of public APIs to explore. You'll see Twilio there, you'll see Stripe there, you'll see Twitter there, you'll see lots of public APIs. The community forum, community.postman.com, is where folks go to share what they're working on. So you can find information there about upcoming Postman events and more. And if you want to check out the workspace that we use today, the link to that is available in the slides as well. Here's some more background information on what you will find on our webpage for Postman student programs, plus your unique link to sign up for the expert training and badge, which again is free. You'll need that for the challenge that we'll talk about in a second. We have around 10,000 folks on our Discord server as well, including my team, who are all on Discord to help each other. If you're looking for a community, you've got one with us, and please don't hesitate to reach out to us there. Our Discord community also gets exclusive access to hackathons and challenges and projects and stuff like that. So it's worth checking out if you want more and more projects for your portfolio. Now, I know some folks have been waiting for this part. We have a challenge for the audience, and if you succeed at this challenge, you will earn some free Postman swag. So on Twitter and LinkedIn, you can tag us in a new post in which you describe what you learned about APIs during this workshop. Please don't forget to add the student expert badge from your training. Remember that you have your own unique link to sign up for that free training. And once you have your badge and your cool learnings to share, use the hashtag Postman Student and Girls ReCode, then tag me as the presenter so that we know we can easily find your tweets and posts. Just to emphasize further, winning posts will have details about what was learned during the workshop, plus an image of the expert badge that was earned. We've seen folks share images of their handwritten notes, create Twitter threads with multiple learnings, so feel free to get creative with it. I believe Neha will be on the lookout for these posts, and she'll be the one to distribute swag store codes to the winners of this challenge. Those swag store codes can be used to select whatever items you want from the Postman swag store. And then this is a feedback form for me to let me know how this workshop was. It's super valuable for me to know if something felt too fast, if maybe you wanted to see something else that we didn't get a chance to look at, or if you would like to see API 102, the next step up from this one. It'd be really great for me to see that information so that me and my coworkers and colleagues who do these workshops can be even better next time. Because again, the whole point of this is that folks are learning. Awesome. There's that link to your unique link to the expert training. But I am open for a Q&A. Looks like we have about 5 minutes here. So please let me know if you have any questions. Looks like we have a couple folks, so feel free to jump off of me if you have a question on your mind. Maybe, maybe not. Neha, would you happen to have a question?
Maybe it's just something about yourself, like how did you get into coding and how did you start working with Postman?
Yeah, definitely. So I, like I said in the very beginning, didn't actually pursue a computer science degree. I was an elementary and early ed school teacher, and I have always been obsessed with education. And so when I left teaching, I was actually a kindergarten teacher, and we were just starting to dip our toes into programming for kindergartners. And so what we were doing was coding little bee robots. We called them bee-bots. And I personally felt like the kids really enjoyed that, and I wanted to bring more of that into the curriculum. But I also didn't want to I've been calling it half A55. I didn't want to half A55 that. And so I actually went to a coding boot camp to become a better developer myself so that I would be more of a professional, more knowledgeable on programming, software engineering, and all of that before I shared that knowledge with others. So I went to a coding boot camp, became obsessed, started wanting to build tools for teachers. I built up some of my portfolio with those projects and started volunteering for women who were doing some of the same stuff, and eventually found myself in the student programs here at Postman continuing to teach. So that's kind of been my journey. Felt very fast. It was actually very fast, but that's more or less the gist of that.
That's so cool.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so does anybody else have any final questions before we wrap up? No? Okay. Well, I think that's it for our workshop today. I'm going to stop the recording now.